Basically, my whole life I've been in and out of the hospital. And it occurred to me after there was no real help because I finally got enough memories back to remember my life and relive it. When I went to the hospital, I was able, 3 different times last year, I was able to really see from a different perspective how abusive the system is. I was able to interview other patients, I was able to talk to them and essentially find out really the truth of how this whole system's fucked. And my only option was to keep going, like to go further into myself, into this, into healing, into figuring out a way to make the support for people. And in this modern world, most people, a lot of people don't know how to connect with other people, or they have, and then it's like ultimately been like a difficult thing and it failed, whatever else. And people have become so isolated in a way, like that it's like harder to get them motivated to want to interact with people or different things, really because of social media too, right? Social media or media, like being able to get in touch with people so easily. So it's like, well, I've seen your videos, I've seen your stuff, I've seen your things, but actually meeting would be like a totally fucked up thing, right? Like that concept. So I'm like, well, and for some people, they're so starving for that attention, they have to be around the people, and then they go do reckless things to interact with people. Or like they're on the other side of like, fuck, like I can't even get out of my house, I'm watching, I'm fine, right? Or people tell themselves they're fine ultimately until they're really triggered by something. And I realized, well, in this healing process, talking to each other through a screen, talking to, ultimately to each other, I say, like, started talking to myself, is a method of healing. And I found others in myself. Like, I'm talking to myself, and that brought out other personalities, other characters that strengthened, which I labeled as my different personalities, right? Like multiple personalities that I've been diagnosed with, but ultimately that's just something that's inside of you. And when you realize that's you, you're different in different circumstances, because ultimately the people around you or the environment or that circumstance brings up something to do with something else. Like, we all have a degree of PTSD, right? We all do. It just depends on the type of trauma you've experienced and then how you see that type of trauma. And that's where a lot of people get so mixed up too, because something could happen, like to me, after being abused for so long, something could happen and I'm too, like, right, like I don't even realize, maybe it's harassment, maybe it's not, or I kind of brush it, like I'm like whatever, like, whereas somebody else, it's like this big fucking thing, right, to them, and they, that's their perspective, but I'm looking and going, that's like the person's intentions weren't what you thought it was, you're just fucking whacked on a different level, right? Like, ultimately this came down to making a, like, literally making a rehab online in my own way, but making a rehab in my world too, of going, like, really, really, like, when you go to rehab, right? The intentions behind a rehab, any type of rehab or help or support, institution, anything really. Like, and I say rehab, I've never touched a drug. Rehab is, like, to me, rehabilitation, like, of healing of something. So for me, it's the brain, right? My rehab of the brain. Um, is when you go to a rehab, or a help, you're getting away from that environment, right? So you're away from the whatever circumstance and environment that was, so that you can heal. But ultimately, if you go back into the environment, so you go back to your house, you go back to the same people, you go back to that, you haven't actually dealt with what's going on either, because you separated yourself, you went into a different world, which we have to do at times, right, to heal. Like, that's why so people that haven't dealt with trauma, they might go to like a spiritual retreat, or they might go, well, I need to find myself, and they take off into the woods for weeks, or they go on trips by themselves, whatever. All of that ultimately, go sit on a hilltop and fucking meditate for whatever, is an escapism. People that haven't been blessed to know how to do that, or have the opportunities to do that, or been taught kind of that, that's where, addiction can come. Like, we all have some sort of an addiction in life, some people do, whether you realize it or not. But a really negative addiction. So a drug addiction, an alcohol addiction, a substance, abuse problem, a gambling addiction, a sex addiction, something that escapes you, like takes you away, because ultimately, like, you're like, that's the only thing that, like, you can really get to escape, because that really, though, that has to come down to your brain, but also your environment. You're not in like, you're either not able to really recognize where that comes from, or something in your environment still triggering you. You're still not free, like, to really not willing that, or able to be like to be able to look at themselves and their own patterns, right? Like, I couldn't be by myself when I was a kid in a lot of ways, so you look for distractions of other people, meaning I couldn't be by myself. Like, I didn't know what to do with myself because I wasn't taught hobbies. Like, I didn't learn that as a kid, those skill sets, because I was always in survival mode, in trauma. So I went to binge eating, overeating, and then the thought process is, I'm gonna get fat, oh my god, and you're more focused on your appearance or on different things than you are on what's actually happening around you to fucking cause that problem in the first place, right? Because that's that your self-worth is tied to something else. And then the ultimate fear that you have is yourself. Like, the core of that eating disorder was the fear of myself. I don't know what to do with myself. Right? How are you spending your time? And if you weren't taught self-worth, and like from a young age too, like, people are like, you're brainwashed into believing you're only meant for one thing, then you're gonna struggle. You're gonna struggle for the rest of your lives, and everything else is essentially false. So I just learned how to master this, ultimately what they call bipolar, two personalities, but that's because I had to. That was an adaptive thing that my brain had to do to survive, because I'm living a lie. But as a child, you don't know that. But then at what point does that change if you're not properly helped? And there was no proper help. The doctors didn't understand my condition because they don't understand the condition as a whole, because they weren't operating to understand it. This has been like the scientific discovery of a lifetime, if pieced together properly by the right people. I ultimately know the answers for myself. I found that out, both scientifically and spiritually. I know that. I do. And it's a matter of now, going through the steps and piecing that together and teaching more people how to do that, because ultimately, it is just, I'm in a rehab, right? But I'm in a rehab in an unconventional way, having to still deal with the stuff in the environment, like the triggers and the things, right? I've been forced, right? Because there was so much failure in the system, I was been forced to go inwards. I ultimately chose that, though. I could have killed myself. I thought about suicide every day, but because of my belief in something bigger than myself, which ultimately is myself, right? Because I believe, in this, I do believe in all of this being pieced together, everything in my life from the universe being put on me. Like, they say, God doesn't give you struggles you can't handle, right? And I used to argue that. Then why do I want to kill myself every day? Why do I want to kill myself every day? Because it's hard. Because it's lonely. Because you're living somebody else's life. Forced to live somebody else's life. So when people tell me to keep giving up, right? Like, I'm just supposed to accept what everybody's done to me. I'm just supposed to accept it. That is giving into their way, and they don't get my brain because they haven't had that much injustice. They don't understand how they're continuously giving support over to the abusers. And abusers don't understand their abusers. Of course they don't. They're narcissists. My ex does not understand at all he's abusive. He only labels me crazy. So anybody continuously labeling people crazy without understanding that the function of how the system is contributing to that, and ultimately they probably are too in their lives in some way by turning away from it. If you've ever turned away from somebody who's mentally ill, just look down on them for even one goddamn second. You ultimately really need to look inside yourself, because there's something not right with you.